The night I slow danced with my fiancé's twin brother, I told myself it was an accident. I'd had 2 glasses of wine. The banquet hall at the Fairmont was loud, one of those charity galas where the string quartet competes with 200 conversations happening at once. My fiancé, Jonathan, had gone to find us another round of drinks, and I was standing by the edge of the dance floor in heels that had already started to punish me for wearing them. Someone touched my elbow. A familiar touch, that particular pressure Jonathan always used when he wanted to get my attention in a crowd. I turned around smiling, already reaching for his hand. It wasn't Jonathan, it was Sebastian, and before my brain caught up to what was happening, I had already stepped into the dance. I should back up. My name is Phoebe, and at 29 I was engaged to a man I genuinely believed I loved. Jonathan Hargrove was everything my mother had quietly prayed for on my behalf. Stable, kind, handsome in a reliable sort of way. He was a civil engineer who coached youth hockey on weekends and always remembered to ask about my sister's kids by name. We'd been together for 3 years. We'd moved into a condo in Westmount together. We had a joint bank account and a shared calendar, and a reservation at a venue in the Laurentians for the following September. I was happy, or I thought I was, or I'd been so busy being grateful that I'd confused gratitude for happiness, and I'm not sure I knew the difference yet. The first time I met Sebastian was at Jonathan's parents' house in Outremont, a few weeks after Jonathan and I had gotten serious. It was a Sunday dinner. His mother, Cécile, made this elaborate pot roast that I later found out she only made for people she was considering approving of. There were 8 of us around the table. Jonathan's parents, his older sister and her husband, a family friend named Gilles, and Sebastian. Jonathan had mentioned he had a twin, but he'd said it so casually. Oh, and my brother Seb will probably be there, that I hadn't fully processed what identical twin would look like in person, until Sebastian walked through the door, and I almost choked on my water. They were the same height, same dark hair, same jaw. But where Jonathan moved through a room like someone who had nowhere in particular to be, Sebastian moved like he owned the square footage beneath him. Jonathan wore a Patagonia vest to family dinners. Sebastian wore a charcoal blazer with no tie and made it look deliberate. Jonathan laughed easily and often. Sebastian smiled rarely, and when he did, it landed somewhere between amused and calculating. "You must be Phoebe," Sebastian said, and the way he said my name, not as a greeting, more like a confirmation of something he'd already decided, made me straighten up slightly. "And you must be Sebastian," I said. "Seb," Jonathan said, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "Nobody calls him Sebastian except our mother when she's angry." "Which is often," Cécile called from the kitchen. Sebastian looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, then turned to pour himself a glass of wine. That was it. That was the whole interaction. I told myself the weird flutter in my chest was just the strangeness of meeting someone who looked exactly like a boyfriend but wasn't him. I was very good at telling myself things. The months that followed were full of family events, because the Hargroves were that kind of family, the kind that celebrated every long weekend and half the saints' days on the calendar. And Sebastian was almost always there. He was the quieter twin, where Jonathan would hold court at the dinner table. Seb would sit at one end and listen, occasionally saying something sharp and precise that cut right through whatever debate was happening and settled it. He worked in private equity, something to do with infrastructure investment that I never fully understood, but that clearly paid well, based on the apartment he had in the plateau and the way he traveled without seeming to think about what it cost. He was not easy to be around. I want to be clear about that, because I think the easy version of this story is that he swept me off my feet, and that isn't quite right. He was actually somewhat exhausting. He had opinions about everything and didn't soften them for anyone. He once argued with his own father for 40 minutes about the merits of the Caisse de Dépôt's investment strategy, and I couldn't tell if he was enjoying himself or just constitutionally incapable of dropping a point. But he also, and this is the part I kept filing away under irrelevant, paid attention in a way that most people don't, not in the obvious way. He didn't ask a lot of questions, he just noticed things. The second time we were at the same dinner party, he handed me a glass of sparkling water without me asking, because I'd mentioned once that I got headaches from wine on an empty stomach. 3 months later, at a birthday party for Jonathan's sister, He turned the seat next to him slightly outward before I sat down, because he'd seen me struggling with the angle the last time. Small things. Things Jonathan never would have noticed. Not because he didn't care, but because he simply wasn't wired that way. I started to understand why his family called him the difficult one. Jonathan proposed on a Thursday evening in November, in our kitchen, with takeout getting cold on the counter and a ring he'd apparently been hiding in his gym bag for 2 weeks. It was so Jonathan, earnest and slightly chaotic and so full of love that I cried immediately and said yes before he'd even finished asking. I was happy. I was genuinely, fully happy. I want that on the record. The engagement party was his parents' idea. Cécile insisted on hosting it at the Fairmont's ballroom. We only have one son getting engaged. And within 3 weeks she had organized something that could generously be described as a gala, and more accurately described as Cécile Hargrove, demonstrating to every person she'd ever met what excellent taste she had. 200 guests, a string quartet, past canapés that were better than anything I'd eaten at most restaurants. My own parents flew in from Halifax, my mother already clutching a handkerchief in anticipation of being moved by something. It was a lot. It was enormous and expensive and slightly overwhelming. And Jonathan was across the room talking to his university friends. And I had been standing alone by the dance floor for longer than I'd intended, and that was when the hand touched my elbow. And that was when I turned around smiling and stepped into Sebastian's arms before I realized they weren't Jonathan's. Here's what I need you to understand about that moment. I knew within about 3 seconds that it wasn't Jonathan. The hand on my back was in a different place. Jonathan always rested his palm lower, a little too casual. This hand was between my shoulder blades, deliberate, and the way this person moved, measured, unhurried, wasn't how Jonathan danced, which was enthusiastically and with no particular regard for the beat. I should have stepped back immediately. I didn't. I told myself I was processing. I told myself I didn't want to make a scene at my own engagement party. I told myself a lot of things in those 4 or 5 seconds, while the string quartet played something by Debussy's and Sebastian Hargrove danced with me like we'd done it 100 times before. You knew, he said quietly, close enough that I could hear him clearly under the music. That you weren't Jonathan? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Yes, and in nothing, I said. I'm stepping back now. I did step back, and I want to be very precise about what happened next, because I've replayed it many times since then. Sebastian let me go immediately. No hesitation, no attempt to hold on. He just dropped his hands and looked at me with that expression I could never fully decode. Not triumph, not amusement exactly, something more like I see you. You looked like you needed saving from your own party, he said. I didn't need saving. No, he agreed. You never do. And then Jonathan appeared with 2 glasses of wine and a grin, and Sebastian accepted a handshake from his twin and disappeared into the crowd. And I stood there for the rest of the evening, with my fiancé's arm around my waist, feeling like the floor had shifted 3 inches to the left without anyone else noticing. The problem, and I want to be precise about this too, because I spent a long time refusing to call it a problem, was that nothing happened after that. Sebastian went back to behaving exactly as he always had. At Christmas dinner at the Hargroves, he argued about transit infrastructure and handed me a plate of his mother's tourtière before I'd asked. He didn't mention the dance. He didn't look at me differently. He was just Seb, difficult and perceptive and quietly present in his particular way, and I went back to planning my wedding. We booked the florist in January. We went to a tasting at the Laurentians venue in February. Jonathan and I drove through a snowstorm on the 117 laughing about how badly we'd ordered at the tasting. Too much of everything, 3 kinds of fish. And I thought, this is my life, this is a good life. This is what I chose. March was when things got complicated. I was working late at my office. I'm an urban planner with the city, and we'd been in the thick of a community consultation process that had gone sideways in the way those things sometimes do. And Sebastian texted me, which he'd never done before. We had each other's numbers because of a family group chat, but we'd never once communicated directly. The text said, "There's a lecture at McGill tomorrow night on transit-oriented development. Your name came up in the program notes for the Côte des Neiges consultation. Thought you might be interested." And then a link. I stared at my phone for longer than I should have. Then I typed, I'm in that consultation. I know about the lecture. And then, because I am apparently incapable of not engaging, why do you care about transit-oriented development? He replied. I don't. I care about things that are done well. That was it. That was the whole conversation. But I went to the lecture, and he was there, and we ended up standing outside the Leacock building afterward in March, cold, that was still absolutely unforgiving, arguing about whether density mandates near transit corridors could actually change driving behavior, or just displace it, and I completely lost track of time. I got home at 11:30. Jonathan was already asleep. I stood in the dark kitchen for a while before I went to bed. I told myself it was intellectual, that it was just nice to have someone engage seriously with my work, because Jonathan, bless him, glazed over a little when I talked about land use policy. I told myself that Sebastian was my future brother-in-law, and it was good that we were developing a rapport. I told myself a lot of things. We started texting occasionally after that. Never about anything personal. He'd send me something about a city planting case in Helsinki or Vancouver, and I'd respond with something snarky, and he'd respond with something snarkier, and then it would stop and we wouldn't talk for 2 weeks. It was not a relationship. It was not even close to a relationship. But here is what I know about myself, looking back. I was always a little more awake in the hours after those exchanges than I was the rest of the time. Like the volume on everything had been turned up a notch. April came, and with it Jonathan's younger sister Margot's engagement. Yes, 2 engagements in the family in the same year, which Cécile was handling with barely contained euphoria, and there was a dinner at the Hargrove house to celebrate. I was helping clear plates in the kitchen when Sebastian came in with a stack of glasses and set them on the counter beside me. You seem tired, he said. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I looked at him. He was looking back at me with that same steady attention, no particular urgency, just waiting. The consultation has been hard, I said. There's a community association that's been blocking the density proposal for 6 months. They're worried about neighborhood character, which is a polite way of saying they don't want the area to change, which is a polite way of saying they don't want certain people to be able to afford to live near them. And you can't say that. I can absolutely not say that. That must be exhausting. It is. There was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, which was the thing about Sebastian. Silence with him didn't feel like a gap that needed filling. You're good at your job, he said eventually. How would you know that? I read the consultation report you filed with the city. It's online. He picked up the glasses again. For what it's worth, the section on displacement risk is the clearest writing I've read on the subject. He went back into the dining room. I stood at the kitchen sink for a while with the water running. I broke off the engagement on a Sunday afternoon in May. I need to be very clear. It was not because of Sebastian. Or, it was not only because of Sebastian, and I think that distinction matters enormously. It was because Jonathan and I had sat down to finalize the wedding timeline, and somewhere between the seating chart software and the debate about whether to do a receiving line or mingle cocktail style, I had looked at this man, kind, earnest Jonathan, who loved me and was good to me, and would have made an excellent life with me, and I had felt something close to grief. Not grief that I was marrying him, grief that I wasn't more fully in it. Grief that I had been going through the motions of happiness so convincingly that even I'd been convinced. Right up until the moment I wasn't. The consultation had taught me something, I think. You can't just displace a problem to another neighborhood and call it solved. At some point, the problem has to be addressed where it actually lives. Jonathan cried. He didn't yell, which maybe would have been easier. He just sat on our couch and looked at me with this expression that I'll carry with me for a long time and said, "Is there someone else?" "No," I said, and I meant it. There was no one else. There was just a version of my life I hadn't been honest about wanting. He moved out within 2 weeks. I kept the apartment. We were achingly civil to each other about it, which was somehow worse. I didn't contact Sebastian. I want to be clear about that too. I didn't reach out to him, didn't tell him what had happened, didn't do anything that would look, from the outside, like I'd been waiting for a door to open. He texted me 6 weeks later. It said, "Jonathan told me, are you okay?" I typed and deleted 4 different responses. Then I wrote, "No, but I will be." He wrote back, "I know. We didn't see each other for 3 months after that. I'd asked Cecil gently to give me some time before I started coming to family events again. She'd been surprisingly gracious about it in that brisk French-Canadian way of hers, where grace looks almost indistinguishable from efficiency. And Sebastian didn't push. It was August when he called me. Actual phone call, which felt almost archaic by then. "There's something I want to say to you," he said, "and I'd rather say it in person if you're willing." We met at a café on Avenue du Parc. It was one of those August evenings that make you forgive Montreal for February. Warm but not punishing, the trees still full, the terrace half filled with people who looked like they had nowhere else to be. He was already there when I arrived. He stood up when I came in, which was such an unexpectedly old-fashioned thing to do that it almost made me laugh. We ordered coffee. There was a silence that was slightly more charged than usual. "I noticed," he said, "that the dance at the engagement party wasn't an accident." I set down my cup. "No, it wasn't. I noticed that you didn't step back right away." "I didn't. I want to be honest with you about something." He turned his cup on its saucer once. "I was aware that what I felt toward you was a problem from very early on. I made a decision not to act on it as long as you were with Jonathan. That's not something I want credit for. It was just the line." I looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you're not with Jonathan anymore, and I don't want to spend another few months not saying it, while pretending I'm texting you about transit policy." "You were texting me about transit policy." "I was texting you about transit policy, and also telling you that you're the most interesting person I've met in years," in the only language that felt like I was allowed to use. The terrace was very loud and also very far away. Someone at the next table was laughing about something. "Sebastian," I said, and then stopped. He looked at me. "You can call me Seb, I know," I said. I need you to understand that I didn't end my engagement because of you. I know that, and I'm not ready to jump into anything. I just came out of a 3-year relationship and an engagement, and I still have to figure out how to be at your family's Christmas dinner without it being catastrophic." "I know that too. You're very calm about this. I've been thinking about it for 18 months, he said. "I've had time to work through the nervous part." I laughed. It surprised me. It surprised him too, slightly, and that small break in his composure was maybe the most reassuring thing I'd seen from him. "Okay," I said. "Okay? I'm not saying yes to anything. I'm saying okay to the conversation." He nodded, like that was both exactly what he'd expected and exactly enough. That was 14 months ago. I'm not going to pretend the rest of it was simple. It wasn't. Jonathan found out that Seb and I had started seeing each other sometime around October, and the conversation that followed between the twins was one I wasn't part of, but that I know left marks. Jonathan didn't come to Christmas that year. His parents navigated it with a kind of exhausted professionalism that spoke to years of practice, managing 2 people who'd been complicating each other's lives since the womb. Margot, to her credit, texted me in November to say that she didn't think I was a terrible person and that she hoped things settled down, which was probably the most I could have asked for. My own mother, when I told her, was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she said, "Well, I liked Jonathan very much." Pause. "But I also thought, when I met Sebastian, that he looked at you in a particular way." Another pause. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place." "When did you notice?" I asked. "The engagement party," she said. "When you 2 came off the dance floor. I've thought about that a lot. About what other people see that we can't, because we're too busy looking at the story we've decided we're in. Jonathan has a girlfriend now. I know this because Cecile mentioned it, not unkindly, at a family dinner in the spring. The first one I'd been to in almost a year. She's a physiotherapist from Laval. He seems happy, from what I can tell, and I want that for him. I genuinely do. He deserved someone whose whole heart was there, and mine wasn't, and I hope, we both understood that eventually. The consultation finally got resolved, by the way. The density proposal went through, modified, with additional community benefit provisions that I think actually made it better. I presented the final report to the city council in April. Seb came to the public gallery and sat in the back row, which I pretended not to notice and absolutely noticed. After, on the steps outside City Hall, he said, "The section on displacement risk was still the best part. You're insufferable," I said. "You've mentioned that. I've mentioned it because it keeps being true." He put his hand at the back of my shoulder blades. That same deliberate place, the same pressure I'd felt the first time. And we walked to the car. I don't know how to tidy this up into a lesson, because I'm not sure it is one. I made choices that hurt someone I cared about, and I'll hold that. I don't think I was a villain, but I don't think I was innocent either, and I've stopped trying to adjudicate which one I was and started just trying to do better with the information I have. What I know is this: there's a difference between a life that looks right and a life that feels true. I spent a long time not knowing the difference. I think I'm learning. And I know, that the man who hands you sparkling water before you ask and reads your city planning reports and dances with you, like he's been waiting for the song to start, is worth the complicated middle part to get to. Even if you have to go through a dance floor at the Fairmont, and a lot of cold March sidewalks, and a very hard Sunday afternoon in May to find out.